let's take the first topic first of all, and that is digging your data mine and how to best identify the most valuable data. Paramjeet, would you like to start with that perhaps and tell us a little bit about how you see digging data?
Data mining is very key. I mean, we talk about the 4 V's. One of the V's that we've probably omitted from there is value. Yeah. That's the whole reason that we go into this data mining. It's the business value that you get out of this. The data that you get, whatever the source is, whether it's structured data, unstructured data, social media, machine data, it's all a cost. To ingest that, to process that is all a cost. Once you actually turn that data into information and act on it, then it becomes valuable information, and that's the key, and that's where the data mining is so key. That's that pivotal point from turning your cost-based data acquisition into decision-making information. You know? Now, where that decision-making process comes in, where that data mining comes in, depends on the use cases. Some do predictive analytics once the data is brought into your data system and it's stored. However, as we move more and more towards a real-time world and a real-time economy, that data mining needs to happen as the data is coming into your systems, as the data is flowing, and where we're talking about the streaming data. So we have to look about where we're doing this data mining, whether it's in your data systems where it's stored or as it's being generated.
Okay, let's turn there. Let's ask, I think, Zohrab, if we can ask you, looking at the second point here, which is drawing insights from data sets to generate significant business impact. What does it actually mean?
So in terms of generating insight from data, I think the first thing we need to do when we're looking at data is, as data enthusiasts, it's often very inviting to jump right into the data and play around with it and look for insights that way. However, it's very important to first structure your thought process, come up with the relevant questions so that you have an idea of what you're looking for. If we dive into the data and look for insights immediately, we're not necessarily going to get what we're after. It's sometimes very difficult to derive questions, but it is also very important to uncover insights that can lead to actionable outcomes.
So that's a practical application to it. Let me ask Garry now. Garry's head of data governance. So I wanted to ask, in terms of the strategic application of big data to improve operations and services, which is one of the points here, where does governance come into that? Does it first come in at the corporate level before we start talking about data in terms of how we manage that data?
I think it does. I think generally there needs to be a culture within the organisation that embraces data initiatives. I think if your organisation is already kind of progressing big data initiatives, there's probably already a culture within the organisation that is looking to get that value from data. I think you then need the kind of the organisational structure in place that encourages that and helps with the various policies, procedures, roles and responsibilities around what data you're using, how you're getting that data in the first place, how you're managing it, and how you're understanding the quality of that information to actually get value out of it. So definitely it needs to come from the top down, but I think you need the skills and you need the specialities in operational areas as well that both understand the technical aspects of how to manage data, but also the business aspects of what that data actually means. I think one of the key things, it's not a V, but context is a massive thing when you're talking about big data. I think without context, you're not able to realise the value at the end of the day. So you need people that have got the business knowledge in key roles to be able to leverage the data correctly.
I know that in one session that I was chairing just a few weeks ago with a number of CTOs, they were actually saying that people at the top actually needed to be advised better, even to write their own corporate governance about data. So how much of that really happens in the real world? How many CTOs or how many people who work with the CTO really have to go back to the C-suite and say, look, this is really how we should be operating as a company? Let me ask you, because from InterContinental's hotel's point of view, there's a lot of data there which is shared data and an awful lot which isn't. So how would you approach that from a corporate point of view without giving away a trade secret? how you would structure the governance from the top down.
First of all, an important aspect of dealing with data is leadership, and you have to have the right leadership in the company, in any company, not just IHG, so that leaders are willing to be overridden by data, not relying on gut feeling, not relying on their intuition, but actually relying on the data. So it's up to the managers of data to influence these people, to show them that the data is saying something which is perhaps not in accordance with gut feeling. And that's a change that we've seen over the evolution of since the 1980s, when I think the first Coke machine in Carnegie Mellon University was able to inform the company when it was out of stock. So we've evolved from that era to the point where it's up to us to convince leadership that the data is saying something, and the leadership has to have the humility to be overridden by what the data is saying.
SAP deals with an awful lot of companies in the region and beyond. So in terms of formulating some sort of tight ruling or some sort of governance from the top down, how much of that do you have to advise on prior to advising a company how to put its structure together in terms of big data management?
Now, if you've got an organization that just has a few hundred rows moving around, very easy to govern, you can do all of that manually. But when we're putting it into the context of the big data, as your data grows, you need to have the policy in place to manage that. So we have a whole department, governance, risk and compliance, and they do go hand in hand. There's a lot of regulatory reporting, and if you don't have your data governance in the right place and your quality, you cannot comply. The risk is hugely important. Before the banking crash of 2001, 2008, et cetera, you didn't have a chief risk officer. Now they're everywhere, right, because they've understood the value. So from an advisory perspective, what we do is make sure that they understand the value of governance, risk and compliance, and how it can add value to their organization as they grow, build up the Internet of Things, the big data, and how it can help them innovate and move forward in the future without affecting their current business operations.
Garry, from your point of view, again, with your focus probably more on governance than the other things, yeah. Does that mean that we've added this extra layer at the expense of being a little bit more open or a little bit more, how can I put this, fluid with our data dissemination? Is that person a policeman who's going to try and put the lid on data transference and data sharing?
What you need to work out is how data is properly shared as an asset across your organization. So rather than someone saying, no, you can't do that, no, you can't do that, no, you can't do that, it's not adding any value. So you need to understand, I think people were talking about that previously, about the privacy and security around data. So you need to understand who can actually look at that data. If they can't look at it, can it be masked so that they can actually pull some value out of that? So there's a central control point that can set policies, but it needs to be done in conjunction with a lot of other areas of the bank. So it can't just be a policeman, because what you find is that people find other means of going around the regulation, right? So if they don't agree with the policy, they'll just create another little data silo over here and then not tell you about it, and then it becomes much harder to manage. It's much better to be much more open and honest across the organization so that you can actually increase the quality of information.
One of our previous conferences, we were talking about data security and the threat posed by hackers wanting to get into your data, either for sabotage or for other means. It's just to get that information. So the management of your data is really very, very important. So not to go into too much detail about security now, but I'll open this to all three of you. What level of security parameters would you normally advise is put into policy even before you get into the setup of all the transactions involving any data?
I think it depends on the type of data that you're dealing with. Obviously, in a bank, you would want more security as opposed to other forms of data, which might not be necessary to have such security. I mean, we were talking about this earlier, and how our email that goes out from various sources, Gmail and Hotmail, Yahoo, etc. It's not very secure, So now we have Proton mail coming in. Obviously, there is a need for security because the consumer demands it. So it just depends on what type of data that you're dealing with. But I think when you're dealing with email, particularly, and email data, Proton Mail will be a leader because it's found a niche in terms of data security.
Are there any questions from the audience to the panel? We have one right at the back there.
One of the things that I feel is important is that you define hacker. Hacker needs to be lowered into gaming. I don't think it's fair to take the strategy and the challenge away from society. This is one of the things that has happened. I'm not that familiar with hacking, but I think it's a great opportunity to advance the minds of the children and the man. So I think taking it out of society and making it into something greater than they're intending it to be is unfair. I think that hacking needs to be separated in gaming, and that you should come up with another way of defining and terming.
I think from the financial services perspective, I think going back to the kind of security aspects of security policies, etc., a lot of that's driven by regulation. Obviously, regulators set out minimum standards. Banks obviously have to comply with that. But I think more generally as well that consumers who use banking products expect the bank to be able to take care of their information as much as they can take care of their financial concerns as well. So I think there's massive forces on lots of different areas of financial sector to ensure that banks aren't being hacked and we aren't subject to data breaches, and there's always a lot of press around laptops getting left in taxis and that kind of thing. So I think there is a big focus on that.
It's a topic that we could go into in a lot more detail, and perhaps we might at some future point. And I do know that there are some hackers, of course, some quite famous ones that have been in this auditorium who have since got smashing jobs with some great companies advising them on security issues. So it is a relevant topic, very much so. We have another question at the front.
A question for Zohrab, Ismail. When you speak about data mining, you said that first we need to kind of have a structured thoughts and have the right questions. I want to take a paradigm shift to it, if you may, and basically question you, why should we be asking the right questions? In the sense, if we question, we are putting some inherent bias to the analysis. Unstructured data, the novelty about it is feedback can be unstructured. But having questions prior to the mining or prior to the analysis kind of narrows down what you want to achieve out of analysis. Yeah. So I understand what you're talking about, questions, but rather than questions, do you think a framework would suit better? Would a framework suit better than having narrowed down questions?
What is the purpose of the data that we have, the big data? What is the purpose? We have a lot of data available. We need to select the data that's valuable. But we have the data available to answer particular questions or solve particular problems. We need to understand what data we need to look at. We have to frame our questions in a very structured manner, methodically, so that we know what we're looking for in the data. There's a variety of data available. Which data do we look at? Once we have the structure in place, then we can look for the answers within the data, and that's what I was alluding to earlier.
So we've covered two of those areas there of volume and variety.
Garry, you are heading data governance unit, which is relatively new concept in UAE banks. So I have two questions. Number one, how old is the unit in your bank? And after you set up this unit in bank, what difference have you been able to see in your organization? And delivery-wise, how a different perspective you have seen in your bank.
So I was brought into FGB around 19 months ago. So the unit is 19 months old. Okay. Prior to my arrival, we didn't have a kind of data governance function at all. So over the last 19 months or so, we've been looking to build that kind of organization up.
Okay. And second question was, in your organization, this data governance unit, what is delivery model of this unit? How you are able to show the output of the unit, which is resulting in business benefits?
The business benefits. So it comes back to the kind of the value part of big data. So what you really have to look at is the use cases around how data is used within the organization. So the business will have some critical needs that they need to be satisfied, and they'll have areas of their business that are impacted by perhaps poor quality information. So I think they're some of the quick wins that you can look at. So go and speak to the business areas, work out where the pain points are around the business, and look to try and make some grounds on the kind of simple process changes or system controls that you can put in place. But I think it's up to the business to kind of prioritize and assess the value that they feel they're going to get back out of that. So there's a lot of interaction with the various business areas. And I think the other aspect is, as well, is it's not always the business value. There's a very heavy regulatory aspect to it. So what we're seeing from coming across from Europe and the US is a lot of regulation that kind of mandates a lot more data control and data governance type organizational structures within a financial institution. Now it's only just starting to kind of reach the region. So I think banks in general would be kind of well advised to be proactive in introducing governance type structures into the organization, not just focusing on the business benefit side of it, which is a big thing for the CEO and for the shareholders, but I think there's also the regulatory implications that need to be considered, because they're going to have massive risk implications and potential fines if you haven't got them in place.
My name is Dr. Mizan Siddiqui. I'm from Public Health. One question to that, I think apart from volume, variety, velocity, and veracity, there should be some element of ethics involved in it, in the big data. And the previous speaker spoke about the data mining. In terms of research, we usually don't do data mining. We have to have perfect hypotheses, and then we have to have the framework, what we're looking for. And then we try to analyze the data so that the data answers the hypothesis, rather than mining it and coming up with something of our own interest and presenting it to the people in the wrong way. So I think this needs to be very much carefully articulated in the regulations and in guidelines, that some element of ethics in data analyzing or data mining should be involved in it.
So is ethics at the top of the list in terms of the functionality of what we're talking about in this subject?
Yeah, I mean, when we look at data mining, for me, and with some of the customers that we talk to, or a lot of our customers we talk to, there's different use cases being designed. I mean, the evolution of analytics and predictive analytics in particular has evolved. It used to be, oh, we'll run a report and let's see what happens. And now we're moving to operational intelligence, what's happening? And then the next phase is, well, what is likely to happen? Yeah, that's where we're going. So it's all well and good us saying, well, we've got this data set, we've got it from lots of different sources, if it confirms what we already believe. Yeah, that's good, and we've been doing that for a while. The next stage is, well, actually, you know what, we've got all this data, it's too much for us to understand. Let's put some algorithms in place to see what the data will tell us that we don't know. Yeah? And then what we can do is we can then assign that with, for example, predictive maintenance. So some of our customers, for example, John Deere in the States, they produce tractors, farm equipment, lots of other things as well, but that's one of the things they do. And they put sensors on all of their machinery. So what they now do is they monitor that 24/7, so that if something is likely to break, and bear in mind, these algorithms are twofold. One is historical algorithm based on how long they expect these parts to last. The other part is real-time monitoring that is tweaking their model continuously. And that's very, very common now. We're seeing that more and more. Historical algorithms combined with real-time monitoring to change the model as it's going on without any human intervention. And what they then do is they say, right, they phone up the owners and say, you are likely to have a part break on your tractor or your equipment today, tomorrow, the next day. We can have somebody there replacing it for you. Okay? What's the value to the customer? They don't lose their assets. They continue running their business. Yeah? And it's that predictive maintenance, that data mining, those algorithms from historical data combined with real time. That's where we're seeing a real trend. Yeah? And not just in manufacturing, retail, lots and lots of other environments as well. Yeah?
So these sorts of applications are really, this comes under the heading of that strategic application section that we were talking about earlier, being able to make sure that that level of security and that level of performance is there hand in hand.
Yeah, and it's all down to the business value for the customer. What is the value for their assets not producing for their business? That's the crux of it. That's the return on investment.
Yeah, that's very clear.
What do we need to do to add value to the guest experience? The data allows us to determine where a particular guest is likely to stay based on their historical data. So we can look at that data and predict where they will stay. And just adding to what Imran was speaking to earlier this morning, there's something called geofencing. I don't know if you've heard of geofencing, but we can actually, the industry can, know when a particular customer is close in the vicinity of any given hotel, and send them a message, perhaps of a promotion in a restaurant, perhaps of a room night. So we can communicate with our guests using this technology and using this data better than we ever could.
And we have one other question.
My name is Sufyan Barghouthi from National Bureau of Statistics. I have two questions, one very short and the other extended if I have the time. Is it okay? The short one is based on what we are discussing about the big data. Are we talking about big data as a public good or a private good at the end of the day? And this will have a lot of implications. So based on your experience, how it is the best to deal with this commodity for the research and analysis and all related issues? The extended question is related to assuming that at the end of the day, small data or micro data or big data, we are trying to have rational decision making and developing inferences. The point that how can we incorporate 3 points based on your experience for the volume and variety. One is related to the coverage, and we know that a lot of data sources, and at the end of the day, we want to have 100% of the phenomena that we are talking or analyzing or whatever. How can we ensure that we are talking about an agreed or clear borders for the data? The other part is related to how can incorporate the metadata issue when we have different sources, different definition, different classification to make sure that the analytics or data mining, whatever, is based on the same conceptual quality framework on that, and even total error framework, whatever the tool that we use. And third, I think it is the sustainability. And we know that a lot of data sources, they easy come, easy go from the market, mainly for the internet companies and data holders. And then how can we develop decision and strategic decision and whatever policies based on who can get in and get out of the market? Thank you.
Shall we start with Garry, perhaps?
Yeah, where do you want to start?
Yeah, can we have a summary of that?
Well, we'll start from the beginning, I guess. Let's start with the first part of the question. If I got that right, it's how do we ensure that corporations can be. Let me have a look at this. Okay, decision making and drawing inferences from the data, which taking into account coverage, incorporating metadata, and also sustainability.
You need the right people that can bring context to the data, otherwise you lose any kind of value. So you need to work closely with your business representatives who know the business and can bring that knowledge to the underlying data. And I think from a governance perspective, you need tools in place that allow you to manage the metadata around the different data sources that you have, so that you're able to, one, I think, specify what your expectations are for data. So working with the business areas to say, what are the data sources we're interested in, but what's the quality of information that we're actually looking for? How would we actually measure the quality of that information? And then building controls in place to say, so that you understand when you do have 100% coverage, or when you have limitations in the data that you're actually using, and be able to record that as part of the metadata of the data you're using. So you need some tools that will allow you to do that, to manage the metadata. And then you also need the roles and responsibilities back in the business areas to take ownership of that. One, to define the rules in the first place, and two, to kind of manage any remedial activities and any follow-up activities.